Good evening and welcome to the Raisina Fireside Chats. This evening we have a very interesting discussant, a scholar, a great contributor to humanities and the arts in the area of human movement. Dr. Jenny Mander, welcome. Dr. Jenny Mander is the co-director at the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Mander. The aspiration towards freedom is the most human, is the most fundamental of all human manifestations, said Eric Hoffer. How true is that?
I think people want security, and they need to feel a sense of belonging. So I think freedom can never come in a fractured, atomized world. So freedom comes together with our social relationships. And I suppose we get our sense of being from a sense of community, which comes from feeling that we belong in a certain context. So for me, that is freedom is in context of society.
We're seeing a migration, we're seeing a hardening of attitudes on the European street towards migration and asylum seekers. And what's your take on that?
I think it's very important that we distinguish between the different legal categories. So there's a legal distinction, of course, between migrants who have no real status in front of the law, other than human rights law, and then refugees who are protected by international law, and asylum seekers. So those are of critical distinction from a legal perspective. They're not uncontroversial. I mean, if you think about the displacement of people for environmental reasons, that is a category of movement that has been included in the more recent Global Compact for migration, for migrants, but not in the Global Compact for refugees. So I think that, the distinctions between a migrant and a refugee are very much up for discussion. But I think crucially, those distinctions between migrants and other protected categories for asylum is not read on the streets. So you're talking about a hardening of attitudes, which, if I may, I'll return to in a moment. But on the streets, people don't wear labels. They might have documentation, but the labels of migrant or refugee are typologies of movement. They're not descriptions of people. And it's a real problem when we start bringing those descriptions to bear on individuals. Now, of course, the person on the street, how do they make those distinctions? In a time where there is anxiety about migration, then it's the marks of what looks foreign that gets read out on the streets by superficial judgments. And the problem there, of course, is somebody might well be a citizen of the state, but if they look foreign, they will be then clumped with a group of people who are seen to be other. So I think that is very problematic, is how we judge, if you like, who is who through this lens of migration and refugeedom. But you asked the question, is there a hardening? I think we need to be really careful about how we tell the story. People tend to big up the problem on one side or the other. Now let's take the case of Ukraine. Now, there's been an overwhelming outpouring of public support. Perhaps some governments are more or less ready to meet the formalities of that process. But take one indication, the Daily Mail, which is a right-wing tabloid in Britain, a tabloid that is known for its anti-immigration status, known for connecting migrants and refugees with violence and with insects, swarms coming in from Calais. The Daily Mail is praising those Britons who are giving support to the Ukrainian refugees. So I think that we have a very checkered history in Europe and in the UK with migration, but it really matters how we tell the story, and there's been quite a lot of, I think, soul-searching on the further left as to whether one denounces the Daily Mail for hypocrisy and who that serves. So I think that so far, there is evidence that on the streets there's not a hardening of migration. That is perhaps being whipped up by other narratives that we need to be careful not to be complicit with.
You mentioned the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and I want to ask you a question. are we witnessing selective solidarity in the liberal spaces of the West? We just read about the German decision to replace Afghan refugees who escaped from the Taliban with refugees coming in from Ukraine. So, are the near dears more important than the distant other?
I think that you have a point there. I think it is a circuit between public opinion where there has been an equal strong support for Afghanistan, but incredibly difficult to actually connect that together with those in need. I think there is also, back to what we were saying earlier about who is recognized on the street and therefore by some of the more tendentious news reporting as being foreign. And of course there is a greater cultural disconnect and perhaps downright ignorance as to even where Afghanistan is for many people in the streets. So I think it is true that that plays into a set of culturally cultivated prejudices. Although I think that we have given in the EU at least some solidarity to Afghanistan and refuge to Afghan refugees, and also in previous contexts with the Syrian refugees, before that Bosnians. So I think it is perhaps not wholly absent from the equation, but I think it is something that has been weaponized also in the narrative process. And it really does matter how we tell those stories about migration and get the right stories out.
Yeah. So I think that's a great point of departure, and we see that we're witnessing a very disturbing trend on the weaponization of migrants and migration in general, but in the Belarus-EU dispute. What do you make of this, and is this an indication of things to come?
It's a very good question. And again, look, I'm not a policymaker. I'm an analyst of, if you like, cultural processes. And again, I think we can't overlook the circuit between the stories we tell and then the security measures that result from those stories. You know, that the response of governance and of governments and policy to migration does tend to take its lead from public opinion and then becomes part of the political campaign. So yes, there has been a weaponization, as people put it, of migrants between Belarus and Poland and in other parts. If we want to address that question, perhaps we also need to start with addressing how we weaponize migrants in the media and in the political stories that are told. If we begin to diffuse that weaponization, if I might use it, that terminology for the narrative process, for how we actually talk about the reception, then it becomes less of a weapon for those who want to use it in terms of real people. From the outside. So I think that we have to be careful about, if you like, diffusing that weapon rather than stoking it. Weaponization in the narrative process, you know, in how we tell the stories in the newspapers, then tends to fuel a certain political angst, which then results in the securitization of borders and walls. We've seen that with Donald Trump's campaign, the Brexit 2016 campaign, Marine Le Pen. Again, they're all examples of where really very different problems have been annexed to a migration story. And then migration has become the lens through which to displace really underlying economic and social issues. And I suppose there the paradox is that it's the inability, perhaps, of certain rural communities or rather uninvested centres of former manufacture that perhaps fuels the anxiety about globalization and the digital revolution, the technical revolution, that then gets displaced onto migrants. So I think we've got already a set of rhetorical strategies that lend themselves to being whipped up and then playing into a much more deadly use of human beings as weapons.
Do you see any changes happening? Do you foresee any changes in the European security, legislative, and political frameworks to deal with the migration crisis?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm a historian rather than a stargazer. Although if one looks at takes the long view on migration, I think many of these crises are not at all new. And I think often the way we tell the story of, say, the reception of the Huguenots after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, we're very selective in what we keep. So I'm not sure it's unprecedented, and I'm sure that political responses will depend on a whole set of societal forces in which there is scope for grassroots and for local communities, NGOs, to play a much larger part in getting other stories out there. I suppose something that we haven't spoken about, and that's what I would call the politicization of culture. And we were talking about the weaponization of migration and migrants that gives rise to an us-them. That can lead to and can be fueled by a very simplistic notion of ethnicity or culture that tries to ring-fence an entire group as representative of a particular culture. That makes any sort of interaction, both receiving people from the outside into a particular state or operating between states. That's been very much the subject of the Raisina Dialogues, is how do we partner. But partnering doesn't just require us connecting digitally and trading in goods and having free flow of capital. We've got to work out what we do with the flow of people as well. Now, if we've got a really hardened notion of what culture is, that we align the nation state with culture, with a particular language or versions of the above, we're in a very precarious position. So I do think that we need to actually rethink what culture might be.
So Dr. Jenny Mander, I'm now going to ask you a question which is very close to your heart. Why do we need to bring in the arts and humanities into the policy-making frameworks? And how is that going to help? And what's your take on that?
One of the things that the SDGs, the United Nations Social Development Goals, has stressed is the importance of what we've just been talking about, namely culture. Culture, I think, as I've been trying to indicate, can be kicked around like a political football. The arts and humanities tend to approach people and cultures with perhaps a more sophisticated lens than the crisis-driven policy planning a politician or policymaker. Therefore, I think it's a different mode of thinking that perhaps allows us to think outside the box. We need new ways of thinking for the future of the planet. We need to draw on different epistemologies. I think we're getting better at looking at different cultural epistemologies. There's a wonderful example of traditional Maori thinking of relationality that is being very much put forward to manage the Antarctic in a different way. I think those different ways of thinking, but above all, thinking about what it is to be human. After all, the technocrat looks for a problem to solve, but that doesn't solve what it is to be human. And ultimately, if we really are going to put the human back at the center of our thinking for sustainable development, we need to think about what it is. We've got a work-obsessed culture. And perhaps that's partly the problem is we need to take time. I mean, one of the key words of this wonderful dialogue is impatient. Yeah. Now, we might want to be impatient for change, but we need to take time to think, time well in advance of the crisis to think about the future, but to think about the future very much in its relationship with the past. So I think that policymakers often don't have the time to think in ways that are little better than ahistorical and towards the future. Most of us get our sense of being by how we connect, to different histories, to different pasts. We perhaps, in the context of the environmental crisis, do well to talk about deep time, deep pasts and deep futures. We are just a little chapter at the moment on this planet. So we do need other modes of thinking.
So thank you very much, Dr. Jenny Mander, for joining us at this fireside. And I hope you have a very good time at Raisina 2022.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.